But as you've been hearing, over the weekend, Putin reportedly put Russia's nuclear forces on special alert. He ordered Russia's military to put these forces, which include these nuclear weapons, on special alert as a result of, and I quote, aggressive statements by the West amid widespread condemnation of his invasion of Ukraine. Well, Sebastian Brixey-Williams is a co-director of the British-American Security Information Council and joins me live on Talk Radio. Evening to you, Sebastian. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us here on Talk Radio. How seriously should this threat be taken by Putin? Is this a bit of sort of propaganda on his behalf, you know, be careful because I could get my nukes, or is it something to be taken seriously?
I think there are several reasons several ways to interpret this threat. So the first one of those is signaling, as you say. Putin already made a thinly veiled nuclear threat at the start of the invasion. He said anyone that tries to stand in our way or create threats for our country and our people would face consequences such as you've never seen. And generally, analysts are saying, well, that's a nuclear threat, although it has a slightly broader remit, perhaps. So now what's happened is a few days into the invasion, he started calling it a special mode of combat readiness of the deterrence forces. Now, we don't really know what that means. Even Russian-speaking colleagues of mine have never seen that particular language before, and we haven't really been able to find it being used elsewhere. So is that a translation? Is that just some kind of loose language, or is that actually deliberately obfuscatory? Is it an ambiguous statement that's meant to leave us scratching our heads? We're not quite sure. The best we can see is that it probably means something about sort of warming up our Russia's nuclear command and control system, and perhaps particularly to ensure that it can deliver a retaliatory strike, even if the commander-in-chief, Putin himself and his deputies, were taken out. But ultimately, we don't really know. Now, there are two other ways you might want to look at this. So in the last couple of days, Belarus has just had a referendum which passed, where they said that basically Belarus would allow the placement of Russian nuclear weapons on their soil. That's something that happened in the Cold War and hasn't happened since. And so in a way, ramping up the nuclear threat on Putin's side is a good way of justifying something like that, which has actually been a long-standing policy goal of the Russian Federation. But then I think there's a third way to look at it, which is kind of the unexpected. We actually can't get inside Putin's head, and we've been wrong about him before. I think very few people actually saw a sort of a full-scale invasion of the Ukraine being a reality 6 months ago. And it is perfectly possible that Putin could surprise us and use, say, a small-scale nuclear weapon in Ukraine or even elsewhere. And I say small-scale with some reservations because it's a relative term. Obviously, it could still be the size of the Hiroshima or the Nagasaki bombs, which would be a small-scale bomb in kind of current terminology. Putin's judgment in launching this war, I think, has to be questioned. Clearly, it's not gone at all as planned. And the rambling speeches that he's made over the last couple of days, I think, also call into question his rationality to some extent. But ultimately, we don't know. And another way of looking at it is that, that kind of rambly speeches and that kind of irrationality is actually Putin trying to play a kind of madman theory, trying to keep the West on its toes, and essentially say, keep out, you're not welcome in this war. This is a local issue that we're going to sort out with the Ukrainians.
And if he were to deploy a small-scale nuclear weapon, surely that would mean that the West, which is... The response has been, obviously, as you know, sanctions, quite heavy-handed sanctions now, getting heavier as days go on. And we've obviously seen the West supplying a great deal of arms and aid to Ukraine, but essentially keeping out of Ukrainian soil, not getting directly involved. If there was even a rumbling of Putin actually using a nuclear weapon or using a small-scale one, as you describe, the West could surely not then stay out of it, could they?
Well, I think we're already in it. I don't think, there's a ladder of escalation here, and that is where we'd have to be extremely careful, because I think if Putin used a nuclear weapon, the worst thing we could do at that moment would be for the West to use one too. The threat is ever present. It's always there. But actually, there are other tools in the toolbox that the West could use in order to respond to that without coming down to that level, in a sense.
So like what? So because there will be people, as you inevitably know, that if Russia deployed any kind of nuclear weapon, there will be people here saying, right, we need to do the same, fight fire with fire. So what can you tell us would be a convincing retaliation to that, which wouldn't go to that scale?
So I'd probably look at cyber weapons there. That's actually somewhere where Russia has some real weaknesses. That's what the Biden administration has tried to draw attention to as the sort of counterweight to those nuclear threats. There is an awful lot that could be done with cyber weapons. I kind of understand the instinctive response. Well, we've got to fight fire with fire. We should use nuclear weapons ourselves. But then you have to really think through, well, where, on what, and to what effect, and what would be the outcome? Because I think any use of nuclear weapons by the West, or by NATO maybe more specifically, would be extraordinarily dangerous. At that point, this transitions from a conflict between the Ukraine and Russia, with a lot of observers who are sort of indirectly involved, to one that is a full-blown conflict between those two sides.
And then it becomes, as we've heard, bandied around, and I've been very reluctant to want to use these terms, but a world war.
It could certainly spiral into that. Yeah. I mean, this is the issue in the fog of war. It's very easy for miscalculation to happen. It's very easy to have misperceptions of what the other side wants. It would be far too easy for Putin, sitting in the Kremlin, to see the use of a NATO nuclear weapon and think, right, this is the start of it. This is where we actually have to unleash everything. Otherwise, we lose the opportunity to do so.
To what extent could lessons be learned from where we are now when it comes to the diplomacy of the West and Russia over the last 35 years? I mean, I've taken a lot of hassle over the weekend on my programmes here on Talk Radio for pointing out, whilst being very careful not remotely to endorse what Putin is doing. I absolutely agree with those people that are condemning him, because I think it's completely awful what he's doing. But I've been trying to offer some explanations into his mindset and the betrayal that Russia feels from the West, the fact that he feels that perhaps Gorbachev and Yeltsin were betrayed when it came to the expansion of NATO, and this idea in Putin's mind that NATO is not a defensive force but something to be feared. And I think that there are potentially lessons that could be learned from the diplomacy between Russia and the West that probably started 35 years ago. Would that be a fair comment to make?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think the issue here is one of empathy, or an empathy failure on both sides. And I think the West needs to look at its own role in that. Empathy doesn't mean you agree with what the other side thinks or does, but it does mean that you really try to understand it. And
that's also how you defeat your enemy too. I mean, you
right.
have to work out where your enemy's coming from. And I've seen too many people just saying, "Oh, well, look, Putin's a madman." Well, it's got to have come from somewhere.
It's very easy to figure him in that way, and it's an understandable emotional response. But there is more to it than that, and it's not just Putin that's been talking about the failure of West-Russia diplomacy for the last 30 years. There are a lot of very rational people in the Russian strategic community who have been saying, much as Putin was saying before he launched the invasion, that the situation, the architecture in Europe is unstable. That there is this sense of Russian. They have a sense of threat from NATO. It is closing on them, and they have those people have enabled Putin in some ways, and Putin has enabled them in some ways. So it's much more complicated than that. I think the trouble is, although there might have been a good situation, say 10 years ago, where there was a kind of buffer zone in Eastern Europe, where there was a zone of neutrality. So Russia didn't feel threatened, but nor did the West, and there was some agreement between the two sides, including those countries, of course, that are in the buffer zone, as to how to manage that well. That didn't happen, and the West does have some fault for that. The eastward expansion of NATO into the Baltics, into some of the countries in sort of southeastern Europe, was something that was done without Russian consent, and in a rather humiliating way. So there is some blame that lies there. The problem is the now. With the invasion as it is, you can't really argue that line as easily. Ukraine is not, as one person on Twitter put it, a meat buffer between the rest of Europe and Russia. It's a country in its own right. It has sovereignty. Its citizens have lives. And there's a great deal of cultural exchange in both directions. So for Putin to have launched this invasion, I think closes that option off for at least the short to medium term.
Absolutely. The point is now any of those people that say, well, this sort of paranoia of Putin, or the fact that, as I was saying, I genuinely believe Putin sees this as not as an invasion but as a defence of Russia. The problem is that now any concessions towards Putin would look like he's then being rewarded for these actions, and that cannot happen. That cannot happen in any way, shape or form. But I am very passionate about us sort of knowing the history as to how we get to this point, and also hopefully learning lessons, because I have a horrible feeling in 30 years' time, we might be talking about all of this again on a different scale. Really good to talk to you. Really good to get your insights. Sebastian Brixey-Williams, co-director of the British American Security Information Council. When we come back, we'll hear from you on this. Also, lots of you making us point on Twitter. Where is Joe Biden? Joe. No one knows where Joe Biden is, so we'll try and work out. But we'll do a Where's Joe section on our show going forward right here on Talk Radio.
Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters